Good morning, everyone. This morning, we're joined by Professor Rosa Brooks, the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Law and Policy, and our Associate Dean for Centers and Institutes at our Law Center. And Rosa, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to be with you this morning. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk about your work. Thank you for joining us. So let's get started. Let's get started. You're both a journalist and a scholar who's worked in the Pentagon, the State Department, the Defense Department. Your work and expertise ranges from issues of national security and defense to now your focus on issues in our criminal justice system and policing. Can you share a little bit about how you see these aspects of your academic and professional background informing each other, and how you've come to focus now on the issues that you're researching and writing about?
Oh, that's a good question. And, you know, I'm a little bit of a dilettante, but I'd like to believe that that works in my favor. I've always found that I envy and admire my colleagues who can pick one topic and just drill down on it forever for 30 years. And some of them can do that and do that in an amazingly rich way, so that even though they're on the same topic for 30 years, every time they talk or write about it, they've uncovered something different and new and interesting. I've never been that way. I tend to, curiosity keeps driving me to look at new things. And when I've been teaching and writing for a few years, I tend to think, oh, I really want to go out and do something else that's different. And then when I've been doing something else that's different for a few years, I think, oh, I can't wait to get back to teaching and writing. And for me, the going out there and doing thing parts of my life have always been the fodder for what I do write and what I do teach when I get back to the academy. You know, that the best way to get, for me, the best way to get new ideas and new insights is to go out and sort of force myself into a completely different world. I don't know. I can never decide. I think it probably depends on people's point of view. I shouldn't say this in front of you, Jack, whether I'm an advertisement for tenure and advertisement against tenure, but I certainly feel that for me, one of the great blessings of being a tenured professor at a place like Georgetown is that you don't have to just pick one topic. You can run around and you can look at a lot of different issues, and you can decide that you want to switch from writing about human rights law to writing about national security to writing about criminal justice, and no one will stop you. And it's an incredible gift. I feel sometimes like we professors don't appreciate how lucky we are, because nobody in the world, except for journalists, gets to do that, but we can do it with much more job security. So for me, when I went off to the Pentagon in the early part of the Obama administration, I had been writing and thinking a lot about the law of armed conflict, but working inside that world for a couple of years on a public service leave from Georgetown really brought together for me a lot of issues in a way that I don't think they would have ever come together if I had just stayed in the academy. And when I came back, I wrote a book called How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything, that really tried to pull together a lot of what I learned. And my most recent foray, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is I became a reserve police officer in Washington, D.C. for more than 4 years. And the book I have coming out soon is about policing and draws on that experience.
And you're also the co-founder of our Law Center's innovative policing program. Can you share a little bit about the program's mission, how it came to be, and what tools and resources the program can bring to our national conversation about racial justice and policing?
Yeah, you know, the origin of the innovative policing program very much came out of my time at going through the Washington, D.C. Police Academy as a reserve recruit officer. And it was fascinating and strange in 1,000 ways. But one of the things that really struck me at the Police Academy was how tactical the focus of what we learned was. You know, we memorized lists of vehicular offenses, and we memorized the 9 property forms and the right color of ink to use when filling them out, and the right way to abbreviate the days of the week when filling out different forms, and how to apply handcuffs to a prone prisoner versus a standing prisoner, and you name it. But this was in 2016, a time that, just as now, the whole nation was essentially having a conversation about race and policing and the use of force. There were protests in the streets. But the one place that nobody was talking about those issues was at the Washington, D.C. Police Academy, where we could have been going through the police academy in 1940 or 1980 or 2000 as opposed to 2016. And that really kind of flabbergasted me, because you would think of all the people and all the places where those conversations should be taking place, the police academy in the nation's capital should be it. So the original germ of the idea for what became the innovative policing program was we created a fellowship program in collaboration between Georgetown Law and the DC Metropolitan Police Department that brought young officers into Georgetown Law for a series of very intensive workshops to talk about what I think of as the hard questions. Race in policing, poverty in policing. What is the role of police in a diverse democratic society? How do you know if policing is even effective? How should we think about these issues? And that program, the Police for Tomorrow Fellowship Program, started in 2017. It was very much an experiment. We did not know if it would be a success, but we're now in our with our third cohort of fellows, and we didn't have an umbrella to put it under at the time. This was, I should mention, this was a collaboration at the Georgetown Law side, involved several of my colleagues, Paul Butler, Christy Lopez, Chris Henning, and Sean Hopwood, all also professors at the law school, and Bill Traynor, our dean, was terrifically supportive from the very beginning. We said we want to do this thing, and we had to have some kind of name for it. It didn't seem to make sense to have 5 professors backed by the dean create a program. So we invented something called the Innovative Policing Program, just as a label to say, well, the Georgetown Innovative Policing Program is sponsoring this fellowship. But these things, as you know, have a tendency, for better or for worse, to take on lives of their own. And very quickly, we expanded beyond that original fellowship program. We started teaching, Christy Lopez and I co-taught a practicum course. We brought some of the content from the Police for Tomorrow Fellowship to the Police Academy, so that the larger group of 150 or so recruits would have access to the speakers and materials we were talking about. We trained our law students to be discussion breakout group facilitators with recruits at the Academy, which was kind of amazing, actually. I mean, we weren't sure that would work either. And more recently, we've created something called the ABLE Project, which stands for Active Bystandership in Law Enforcement, which aims to teach police officers, not just here in DC, but around the country, how to effectively intervene if they see something bad going on, if they see a colleague who's about to do something self-destructive or destructive or illegal or unethical. And that's been a huge program, really led by my colleague, Christy Lopez, that police departments all over the country have signed up for. So something that started just as a convenient and semi-fictional organization to sponsor this one small DC-based program has expanded to become a program that has a very wide range of activities, and it's hugely exciting. Although, like everything else that expands rapidly, it's also been hugely challenging to sort of keep up with we have so many ideas, and it's hard to get them all done. I think that the takeaways for me, there are a couple. One is that as we talk about how to transform policing and how to address some of the deep systemic problems that make policing what it is today, we have to include police officers in that conversation. They're actually often have a lot of common ground with many of the protesters and police critics. And if we can bring them together, we can often make a whole lot more progress than if we don't. And I think another insight that we've really tried to share with others we've worked with around the country is that cultural change in police departments can't just be top down. There's a tendency when there's some horrific event, like the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, to replace the top echelons in the police department, bring in reformers. And that's incredibly important. Leadership matters, but you also have to change the culture from the bottom up. And that means focusing on line officers, on young officers, and getting them to be part of creating change within their departments as well.
Rosa, I'd like you to connect some of the dots of what you've already shared with us in this conversation so far. You have a new book coming out this week. I have it right here. There we go.
It looks very pretty.
Tangled Up in Blue, Policing the American City. It'll be released tomorrow. Congratulations. It's a really, really important moment for you and for our community. And that book does draw upon the work you've been describing, both as a journalist and scholar, as well as your decision to become a volunteer police officer here in Washington, D.C. Can you help us connect some of the elements here? And what are some of the major takeaways from the book? What insights do you hope that you can share through this book from all of this great work that you've been a part of?
The whole time I was working on this book, I had sort of a terrible elevator speech. I tell people that I had been a reserve police officer and that I was writing a book, drawing in part on those experiences. And they would say, "Oh, great, sounds so interesting. What's the one sentence version of your argument?" And I would sort of shrug uncomfortably and say something like, "Well, it's complicated." And they would say, "That's a terrible elevator speech." And they were right. Very unsatisfying thing to say. But I think it's also the truth, and that in some ways is the message of the book. I think that one of the things that really was very powerfully driven home to me during this whole experience was that we live in a political culture that favors these simplistic binary oppositions. Either cops are self-sacrificing, underappreciated heroes, or they are brutal racist thugs. And we have a really tough time moving beyond these black and white opposite ways of framing it. And what was really borne in upon me was it is just so much more complicated than that. Police officers, just like the rest of us, tend to be pretty decent people. There are exceptions, trying to do the right thing, and sometimes they succeed and sometimes they fail. And this is, of course, no surprise, because this is part of the "it's complicated." Most of what is wrong with policing wasn't created by police. That police officers enforce laws that they didn't create, and they operate in a political and social context that they can't do much to change. And we also, of course, we ask them to play a dozen contradictory roles. We want them to be protectors and warriors and mediators and medics and mentors and social workers. And almost nobody's good at any one of those things all the time. And certainly very few people can do all of them consistently well. So I think that was part of, one of the things I saw was, you'd see the same officer who in the course of a single patrol shift would be weeping because they hadn't been able to save someone who had had a heart attack and CPR hadn't worked. And then 2 hours later would be dismissing the residents of the neighborhood they worked in as, animals. And it wasn't simple. And it really also, I think, highlighted the sense of helplessness that so many police officers feel, especially now. When we wonder why police officers lock up so many poor people, it's because city councils and state legislatures and Congress have criminalized so many forms of trivial behavior, trivial offenses, and then says to cops, go out and enforce these laws. When we wonder why police make so many traffic stops, well, it's because we as a society decided that we need armed people with badges and uniforms to enforce even, against civil infractions, turning right on red when you're not supposed to, having a broken brake light. We wouldn't imagine sending armed, uniformed officers to your house if you had missed an IRS tax filing deadline, or if your fence was in violation of residential zoning codes. but we've decided that we're going to use armed officers for this. And these aren't decisions that police make on their own. They don't operate in a vacuum. They operate in a system that they only play a relatively small role in creating. And I say that does not let cops off the hook. My experience, if anything, left me absolutely convinced that there is a tremendous amount about policing itself, how police departments recruit, train, operate, almost everything that needs to be changed. But that's only one small part of a much bigger picture. And in fact, I think when I talk to my law students, one of the points that I try to drive home is, don't think that the problem is the cops. The problem is us lawyers too, in many very powerful ways, right? It's the decisions by legislators to criminalize forms of behavior that shouldn't be criminalized, of prosecutors to aggressively prosecute when public safety interests might dictate not prosecuting. It's the decisions of judges to impose harsh sentences and so on. That cops don't do this by themselves. So in the end, I keep coming back to my completely inadequate elevator speech of what I learned is that it's really complicated. And I don't think that's such a bad thing. I think all problems are complicated. And if we're not willing to grapple with their complexity, we're not very likely to be able to address them effectively.
Well, I'd also say you capture some of that complexity, but you also capture the attention of your reader with your dedication page. You dedicate the book to your mom, but you also, and I'll just read it, and for the men and women of the DC Metropolitan Police Department who do what we ask them to do.
Yeah. No, that's right. I really, I have tremendous affection and admiration for many of the officers I worked with. And I think policing is a broken system in very profound ways. It is a racist system in very profound ways, but we're letting ourselves off the hook if we tell ourselves some story of, oh, the problem is police. The problem is policing. If we could just abolish the police or defund them, that would solve all of our problems. It won't. The problems go much, much deeper. And it's going to take all of us looking in the mirror in order to change them.
Now, given all of the work in which you've been engaged, what's at the forefront of your mind as we watch a new administration begin to enact policy around policing, and as we all continue a national dialogue around police violence and structural racism? Where do you think it's important for policymakers and community leaders to focus as we seek change?
Mm-hmm. I think it's very much related to what I was saying about my rotten elevator speech. That we need to see policing in some ways as a symptom rather than as a cause. That American policing is the way it is, not because policing is bad or police are bad. It's the way it is because we have this criminal justice architecture, which is incredibly flawed and bears the hallmarks and the shows signs of that toxic legacy of centuries of racial discrimination. Its policing is flawed because in our broader society, there's tremendous socioeconomic injustice in terms of patterns of neighborhood segregation, patterns of where are there pockets of entrenched poverty, few jobs, few opportunities, poor public transportation infrastructure, poor education system. Those tend to correlate with higher crime and with more policing. You can mess around with, let's have more cops, fewer cops, different cops. But ultimately, it is very much the moving deck chairs around on the Titanic. If you're doing that, if we want to solve what's wrong with policing, there's a little bit of that can be addressed by saying, oh, police training needs to be different, police recruiting needs to be different, police practices need to be different. Some of that, absolutely. And I, happy to talk more about how we could change those things. But I think that's sort of the tip of the iceberg. And if you want to get to that iceberg, you need to start focusing on those much, much broader, harder to solve problems. And I do think sometimes we, it's comforting to think that the problem is the cops. And this is not to deny there are cops who commit egregious abuses that cannot be excused. But the problem is so much deeper that no amount, we could abolish the police tomorrow. And not only will we, of course, not address the problem of violent crime, which is also real, but we also won't solve the problems of racism and poverty in American society. It won't do anything at all to solve that, because unless we're willing to kind of get underneath, we're not going to be able to do much.
Rosa, I can't thank you enough for taking this time to share your reflections with our community, and congratulations on the release tomorrow of your new book. As we close, is there a message you'd like to share with the members of our community?
It's okay for things to be complicated. That's what the world is like, but that should not stop us. The fact that things are complicated shouldn't stop us from diving in to try to fix them. You have to start somewhere.
Thank you. Professor Rosa Brooks, thank you for sharing with us today and for taking the time to be a part of our conversations. I'm grateful for all that you bring to our academic community, and I look forward to being with all of you again soon. Take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you. For every Hoya, everywhere.